In the small, sun-baked town of Harmony Creek, Texas, lived Sheriff Darla Mays. Darla wasn't just the sheriff. She was Harmony Creek. Everyone knew her, and just about everyone respected her. She'd been born and raised there, knew the back roads like the lines on her own hands, and had a way of looking at you that made you feel like she could see right through to your soul. Darla was a strong woman, not just physically, but in spirit. She'd worked her way up through the ranks, starting as a dispatcher and slowly, but surely earning the trust and admiration of her fellow officers and the townspeople. She was tough on crime, but fair, and always had a kind word for those who needed it. From the outside, Darla had it all. A loving husband, Bob, who ran the local hardware store. A beautiful teenage daughter, Sarah, who was the star of the high school volleyball team. A cozy home with a porch swing where she and Bob would sit and watch the fireflies on warm summer nights. Life in Harmony Creek seemed, well, harmonious. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. A subtle shift in Bob's behavior had Darla on edge. He started staying late at the store, claiming inventory issues. His once warm smile seemed strained, his eyes avoiding hers. Darla, with her years of experience reading people, sensed something was terribly wrong. The perfect picture she'd painted of her life was starting to crack, revealing something dark and unsettling underneath. It was a feeling she couldn't shake, a knot in her stomach that tightened with each passing day. The small changes were almost imperceptible at first. Bob had always been a morning person, eager to greet the day with a cup of coffee and a cheerful good morning, Darla. Now, he lingered in bed, pulling the covers over his head, grumbling something about needing more sleep. Dinner conversations, once filled with laughter and stories about their day, became stilted and awkward. Bob would pick at his food, his eyes darting around the room, never quite meeting Darla's gaze. When she asked him about work, his answers were vague and evasive. Just the usual, he'd say, or dealing with some difficult customers. More and more evenings, Bob would disappear into his workshop in the garage, claiming to be fixing things or working on a special project. Darla would hear the sounds of the radio, playing softly, but when she peeked in, he always seemed startled, quickly shutting off whatever he was doing. Sarah, too, seemed to be acting differently. She became withdrawn, spending more time in her room with the door closed. When Darla tried to talk to her, she would shrug and say, "Nothing, Mom," her eyes filled with a sadness that Darla couldn't understand. Darla's gut churned with a growing sense of dread. She tried to rationalize Bob's behavior. Maybe he was stressed about the hardware store. Maybe Sarah was just going through a typical teenage phase. But deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong, and the feeling was eating away at her piece by piece. The truth crashed down on Darla like a thunderclap on a clear summer day. It was a Tuesday night. Bob had claimed he was working late at the hardware store, and Sarah was supposedly at a friend's house studying for a big exam. But Darla's instinct screamed otherwise. Driven by an unbearable anxiety, she found herself driving toward her own home. The house was dark, eerily silent. She let herself in with her key, her heart pounding in her chest. A faint light spilled from Sarah's bedroom. What Darla saw next shattered her world. The image burned itself into her memory, an unspeakable betrayal that ripped apart the very fabric of her being. Bob and Sarah were together in Sarah's bed. The details, the specifics, were a blur of horror, a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Time seemed to stop. Darla's breath caught in her throat. A wave of nausea washed over her, and the room spun. The carefully constructed walls of her life crumbled into dust. She felt a primal rage, a fury so intense it threatened to consume her. It was a pain unlike anything she had ever experienced, a deep, visceral wound that tore through her soul. In that moment, the respected sheriff, the loving wife, the caring mother ceased to exist. All that remained was a woman consumed by grief, betrayal, and an unquenchable rage. The world turned red. The first few seconds after the discovery were a blur of disjointed images and sounds. Darla stood frozen, a statue carved from shock and disbelief. Her mind struggled to process the scene before her, to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the monster she now saw. Then the dam broke. A guttural scream ripped from her throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated pain. She lunged forward, a whirlwind of fury. Bob, startled and disoriented, scrambled to cover himself. Sarah cowered in the corner of the bed, her face pale and streaked with tears. "What have you done?" Darla roared, her voice trembling with rage. "What have you done?" Bob stammered, trying to explain, to apologize, but the words caught in his throat. He reached out to Darla, but she recoiled as if he were poison. "Don't touch me!" she screamed, her eyes blazing. "Don't you dare touch me!" The confrontation escalated quickly. Accusations flew like daggers, each word laced with venom and betrayal. Sarah began to sob uncontrollably, begging her mother to stop. But Darla was beyond reason, consumed by a rage she couldn't control. The years of trust, the years of love, the years of building a life together, all crumbled into nothing, replaced by an all-consuming desire for retribution. She saw only red. The respected sheriff of Harmony Creek was gone, replaced by a woman driven to the edge of sanity. What happened next was a blur, fueled by pure, unadulterated rage. Darla, a trained law enforcement officer, acted not with calculated malice, but with the raw, untamed instinct of a wounded animal. She didn't think, she reacted. Bob's betrayal had not only broken her heart, but had also violated the most sacred trust a parent can have. Driven by an uncontrollable fury, Darla grabbed a small knife from Sarah's bedside table, a seemingly innocuous object suddenly imbued with deadly potential. The act itself was swift and brutal, a consequence of years of pent-up emotion and a lifetime of protecting the innocent. It was a crime of passion, born from the ashes of a shattered family. She wanted to inflict the same pain, the same violation, that he had inflicted upon her and her daughter. She wanted to erase his manhood, to strip him of the power he had so heinously abused. It wasn't about sexual jealousy. It was about justice, however twisted and misguided. In her mind, Bob had forfeited his right to be a man, a husband, a father. He had become something less than human, and she acted accordingly. The act was not premeditated. It was a spontaneous explosion of grief and rage, a desperate attempt to reclaim control in a world that had suddenly spun out of control. It was an act she would forever regret, but in that moment, it felt like the only thing she could do. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Sarah, hysterical and covered in blood, managed to call 911. When the paramedics arrived, they found Bob in a state of shock, bleeding heavily. The scene was gruesome, and the paramedics worked quickly to stabilize him before rushing him to the nearest hospital, over an hour away. Despite the severity of his injuries, Bob survived. Doctors worked tirelessly to repair the damage, but the trauma was extensive. He underwent several surgeries and spent weeks in intensive care. Ultimately, Bob pulled through, but the physical and emotional scars remained. He faced a long and difficult recovery, both in body and mind. The castration left him permanently infertile and changed him forever. The emotional pain of the betrayal, combined with the violent attack, would likely stay with him for the rest of his life. While he lived, the man he once was gone. The owner of Harmony Creek's hardware store was no more. A new, broken man was all that remained. The flashing lights of the police cars cut through the darkness, painting the quiet street in Harmony Creek with an unsettling urgency. It was a scene Darla had witnessed countless times as sheriff, but this time it was different. This time, the chaos was centered around her own home. When the officers arrived, they found Darla sitting on the front porch, her face pale and streaked with tears, her hands covered in blood. She didn't resist arrest. In fact, she seemed almost numb, as if she were watching the events unfold from a distance. "I did it," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "I did what I had to do." The officers, many of whom were her friends and colleagues, were visibly shaken. They knew Darla, respected her. The idea of her committing such a violent act was almost incomprehensible. They read her rights, and she listened intently, acknowledging each statement with a nod. She didn't ask any questions, didn't offer any excuses. She simply cooperated, allowing them to handcuff her and lead her away. As she was placed in the back of the patrol car, she looked back at her house, at the flashing lights, at the officers standing in her yard. A single tear rolled down her cheek. The weight of her actions, the enormity of the situation, finally seemed to sink in. The sheriff of Harmony Creek, the woman who had always upheld the law, was now a prisoner of it. The perfect life she had once known was gone, replaced by a future filled with uncertainty and regret. The news of Darla's arrest sent shockwaves through Harmony Creek. The town, usually a haven of peace and quiet, was thrown into turmoil. The initial reaction was disbelief. How could their Darla, the woman they trusted to protect them, be capable of such a violent act? As the details of the crime emerged, the community became divided. Some were outraged, condemning Darla's actions as barbaric and unforgivable. They couldn't reconcile the image of the respected sheriff with the woman who had castrated her husband. They demanded justice, calling for her to be punished to the full extent of the law. Others, however, felt a sense of sympathy for Darla. They remembered her years of service, her kindness, her unwavering dedication to the town. They couldn't imagine what she must have gone through to be driven to such extremes. They whispered about Bob's infidelity, about the unspeakable betrayal he had committed. Some even argued that she had acted in self-defense, protecting herself and her daughter from Monster. The local diner, usually a place of friendly chatter and gossip, became a battleground for heated debates. Friendships were strained, families were divided. The once harmonious community was fractured, torn apart by the shocking events that had unfolded behind the closed doors of the sheriff's home. Even the church was affected, as the pastor struggled to find a message that could unite the congregation in the face of such a devastating tragedy. Harmony Creek was no longer harmonious. It was a town grappling with a horrific crime and struggling to make sense of the unthinkable. The courthouse in Harmony Creek had never seen so much activity. News vans lined the streets, satellite dishes pointed skyward, and reporters from every major news outlet descended upon the small town, eager to cover the trial of Sheriff Darla Mays. The atmosphere was electric, a mixture of anticipation, morbid curiosity, and simmering tension. The courtroom was packed. Locals filled the seats, their faces etched with concern and disbelief. Family members sat on opposite sides of the aisle, their eyes filled with anger and grief. The air crackled with unspoken accusations and simmering resentment. The media frenzy was relentless. Every detail of the case, every rumor and speculation, was dissected and analyzed. Pundits debated Darla's guilt or innocence, and talk shows featured experts weighing in on the psychological aspects of the crime. Public opinion remained sharply divided. Some saw Darla as a victim, a woman driven to the edge by her husband's betrayal. Others saw her as a criminal, a law enforcement officer who had abused her power and taken the law into her own hands. As Darla was led into the courtroom, a hush fell over the crowd. She looked pale and drawn, but her eyes were steady. She walked with her head held high, a vestige of the strength and authority she had once possessed. The trial of Sheriff Darla Mays was about to begin, and the eyes of the world were watching. Harmony Creek held its breath. Darla's defense team faced an uphill battle. The crime was undeniable, and the evidence was overwhelming. Their strategy centered around painting a picture of a woman driven to the brink by unimaginable betrayal in a desperate attempt to protect her daughter. The primary defense was temporary insanity or crime of passion. They argued that Darla was not in her right mind when she attacked Bob. The discovery of his affair with Sarah had triggered a psychological break, rendering her incapable of rational thought. They presented evidence of Darla's otherwise exemplary character, her years of service to the community, and her unwavering dedication to her family. They also explored the possibility of a self-defense argument, albeit a highly unconventional one. They argued that Bob's actions constituted a form of abuse against Sarah, and that Darla had acted to protect her daughter from further harm. This was a risky strategy, as it required acknowledging the incestuous relationship and placing Sarah in a difficult position. The defense team called expert witnesses to testify about Darla's mental state and the psychological effects of betrayal and trauma. They emphasized the devastating impact of Bob's actions on Darla's mental and emotional well-being. Throughout the trial, Darla remained stoic and reserved, rarely showing emotion. Her lawyers advised her to express remorse for her actions, but to maintain that she had acted out of a desperate need to protect her daughter. The defense hoped to convince the jury that Darla was not a cold-blooded criminal, but a loving mother driven to the edge by extraordinary circumstances. Sarah's testimony was the most heart-wrenching moment of the trial. The decision to call her as a witness was a difficult one, fraught with ethical considerations. But the defense team believed her testimony was crucial to understanding the events that led to the crime. Sarah, pale and visibly traumatized, took the stand. Her voice trembled as she recounted the events leading up to that fateful night. She described how her father, Bob, had gradually become increasingly inappropriate with her, showering her with unwanted attention and making her feel uncomfortable. With halting words, she described how the relationship had escalated, culminating in the incestuous act that Darla had witnessed. She emphasized that she had felt trapped and powerless, unable to escape her father's control. She testified that her mother, Darla, had always been a loving and protective parent. She described the shock and horror on her mother's face when she discovered them together. She also described Darla's initial reaction and emphasized that her mother had been in shock. Sarah's testimony was raw and emotional, leaving few dry eyes in the courtroom. Her words painted a vivid picture of the dysfunctional family dynamics and the devastating impact of Bob's actions. Under cross-examination, the prosecution attempted to discredit Sarah's testimony, suggesting that she was biased in favor of her mother. But Sarah remained steadfast, insisting on the truth of her account. Her testimony was a powerful reminder of the human cost of the crime and the devastating impact of Bob's betrayal. It also showed how much she loved her mother and how sorry she was for the situation. The prosecution painted a very different picture of Darla Mays. They argued that she was not a victim, but a perpetrator of a brutal and premeditated crime. They dismissed the defense's claims of temporary insanity as a convenient excuse for a violent act. The prosecution emphasized that Darla was a trained law enforcement officer, skilled in the use of weapons and knowledgeable about the law. They argued that she had acted deliberately and with intent, not out of a sudden fit of passion. They pointed to the fact that Darla had used a knife to castrate Bob, arguing that this demonstrated a level of planning and control inconsistent with temporary insanity. They also highlighted the severity of Bob's injuries, arguing that Darla had intended to inflict maximum pain and suffering. The prosecution argued that Darla had abused her power as sheriff, taking the law into her own hands and dispensing her own brand of vigilante justice. They argued that her actions undermined the rule of law and set a dangerous precedent. They acknowledged that Bob's actions were reprehensible, but they insisted that this did not justify Darla's violent response. They argued that she should have reported Bob to the authorities and allowed the legal system to handle the situation. The prosecution sought to portray Darla as a woman who had lost control, a woman who had allowed her anger and rage to cloud her judgment. They argued that she was a danger to society and that she should be held accountable for her actions. They wanted to show that no one is above the law, even a sheriff. Several key pieces of evidence likely swayed the jury, contributing to their ultimate decision. First, Sarah's testimony was undeniably impactful. While the prosecution attempted to discredit her, her raw emotion and unwavering insistence on the truth resonated with the jury. Her description of Bob's actions and Darla's horrified reaction likely played a significant role in humanizing Darla and providing context for her actions. Second, the expert testimony regarding Darla's mental state was crucial. The defense's psychological expert presented a compelling case for temporary insanity, arguing that the trauma of the discovery had triggered a dissociative state, rendering Darla incapable of rational thought. This testimony likely planted seeds of doubt in the jurors' minds about Darla's culpability. Third, the crime scene photos, while disturbing, also provided evidence of the chaotic and unplanned nature of the attack. The lack of premeditation, the use of a small knife found at the scene, rather than a weapon Darla would have had access to, and the overall disarray of the room suggested that Darla had acted impulsively in a moment of intense emotion. Finally, the jury likely considered Darla's prior record and reputation. Her years of service as sheriff, her dedication to the community, and her lack of any prior history of violence painted a picture of a woman who was not inherently prone to violence. This likely made it more difficult for the jury to view her as a cold-blooded criminal. The totality of these factors likely contributed to the jury's ultimate verdict. The hours that followed the jury's departure were agonizing. The courtroom, once filled with the energy of the trial, now felt eerily silent and empty. Darla sat alone with her lawyers, her face a mask of anxiety and uncertainty. Outside, the media waited patiently, their cameras poised, ready to capture the moment the verdict was announced. The town of Harmony Creek held its breath, the tension palpable. Inside the jury room, the 12 men and women grappled with the weight of their decision. They reviewed the evidence, replayed the testimony in their minds, and debated the legal nuances of the case. The deliberations were long and arduous. The jurors were deeply divided, each with their own perspective and their own interpretation of the facts. Some were convinced that Darla was guilty of a heinous crime and deserved to be punished to the fullest extent of the law. Others were sympathetic to her plight, believing that she had acted out of a desperate need to protect her daughter. As the hours ticked by, the tension in the courtroom mounted. Rumors circulated about the progress of the deliberations, fueling speculation and anxiety. The longer the jury deliberated, the more uncertain the outcome seemed. Every rustle of paper, every whispered conversation sent a ripple of anticipation through the room. It was obvious that this case was difficult and heart-wrenching for all who participated. It was a case that they would never forget. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the jury reached a verdict. A hush fell over the courtroom as the jurors filed back into their seats, their faces somber and unreadable. Darla's heart pounded in her chest, her fate hanging in the balance. The foreperson stood and handed the verdict form to the judge. The judge, his expression grave, read the form aloud. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Darla Mays, guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter." A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Manslaughter, not guilty, not murder, a compromise. The verdict was a mixed bag. It acknowledged the severity of Darla's actions, but also recognized the mitigating circumstances that had led to the crime. It was a reflection of the jury's struggle to reconcile the conflicting evidence and emotions in the case. Darla's lawyers breathed a sigh of relief. Manslaughter carried a significantly lighter sentence than murder. Darla herself showed little reaction. Her face remained impassive, as if she were still processing the news. The weight of the trial, the trauma of the past, had left her emotionally drained. Outside the courtroom, the media erupted in a frenzy. The verdict was headline news, sparking debates and discussions across the country. The town of Harmony Creek remained divided, the scars of the trial likely to linger for years to come. The story of Sheriff Darla Mays was far from over. The sentencing phase would soon begin. The sentencing hearing was another emotional ordeal. Both the prosecution and the defense presented arguments for what they believed was a just and appropriate sentence. The prosecution argued for a lengthy prison term, emphasizing the brutality of Darla's actions and the need to send a message that violence would not be tolerated, regardless of the circumstances. They highlighted the long-term physical and emotional damage inflicted upon Bob. The defense, on the other hand, pleaded for leniency, emphasizing Darla's prior good character, her years of service to the community, and the extraordinary circumstances that had led to the crime. They argued that she was not a danger to society and that a lengthy prison sentence would serve no purpose other than to punish her further for a moment of madness. Ultimately, the judge, after carefully considering all the evidence and arguments, sentenced Darla Mays to 10 years in prison. The sentence was a compromise, reflecting the judge's recognition of both the severity of the crime and the mitigating circumstances. Darla showed little emotion as the sentence was read. She accepted her fate with a quiet dignity, her eyes fixed on the judge. She knew that she had made a terrible mistake, and she was prepared to pay the price. As she was led away, she glanced back at her daughter, Sarah, who was weeping openly in the courtroom. A flicker of sadness crossed Darla's face, but she said nothing. Her focus was on the future, on finding a way to rebuild her life after serving her time. Prison changed Darla. The confident, respected sheriff of Harmony Creek was gone, replaced by a quiet, introspective woman haunted by her past. The years behind bars were a constant reminder of her crime and the irreparable damage she had caused. She spent her days reading, reflecting, and attending therapy sessions. She grappled with her guilt, her anger, and her grief. She tried to make sense of the events that had led her to that fateful night and to find a way to forgive herself. Her reputation was shattered. She could no longer be sheriff or likely any kind of law enforcement. During her incarceration, Darla received occasional visits from Sarah. The visits were often strained and emotional, both women struggling to come to terms with what had happened. Sarah's love for her mother was unwavering, but the pain and trauma of the past created a deep chasm between them. Upon her release, Darla found it difficult to readjust to life outside prison. Harmony Creek felt both familiar and foreign. The people she had once known now regarded her with a mixture of pity, fear, and disapproval. She struggled to find work, her criminal record a constant obstacle. She eventually found a job as a waitress in a small diner in a neighboring town, far away from the prying eyes and judging whispers of Harmony Creek. Darla lived a quiet and solitary life, forever marked by the events of her past. She never remarried, never had any more children. She carried the weight of her crime with her every day, a constant reminder of the devastating consequences of a moment of uncontrolled rage. The trial may have been over, but Darla's punishment was far from complete. She was serving a life sentence of guilt and regret. Sarah's life, after the ordeal, was perhaps the most tragic of all. She was a victim of abuse, caught in a web of deceit and betrayal that had shattered her family and her sense of self. After the trial, Sarah was placed in foster care, far away from Harmony Creek and the toxic environment that had contributed to her trauma. She underwent intensive therapy to address the psychological wounds inflicted by her father's abuse and the subsequent events. The road to recovery was long and difficult. Sarah struggled with feelings of guilt, shame, and anger. She blamed herself for what had happened, even though she was not responsible. She had nightmares and flashbacks, reliving the traumatic events over and over again. With the help of her therapists, Sarah gradually began to heal. She learned to cope with her emotions, to forgive herself, and to build healthy relationships. She finished high school and went on to college, studying social work with the goal of helping other victims of abuse. Sarah never fully recovered from the trauma she had experienced, but she refused to let it define her life. She became an advocate for victims of sexual abuse, sharing her story and inspiring others to seek help. Despite the pain of the past, Sarah found a way to create a meaningful and fulfilling life. She proved that even after enduring the most horrific of circumstances, it is possible to heal, to grow, and to find hope. The shadow of what Bob did still hung over her, but it no longer consumed her. Sarah was a survivor. Bob's legacy in Harmony Creek was one of shame and disgrace. The man who had once been a respected businessman and a pillar of the community was now remembered as a monster, a betrayer, and an abuser. After the trial, Bob sold a hardware store and left Harmony Creek, seeking to escape the stigma and the judgment of the townspeople. He lived a solitary life, haunted by his actions and the consequences that have followed. He received little sympathy from the community. Most people viewed him as the architect of his own misfortune, a man who had brought ruin upon himself and his family. His name became synonymous with depravity and betrayal. Bob never publicly apologized for his actions. He remained silent, unwilling or unable to confront the pain and suffering he had caused. He lived the rest of his life as an outcast, shunned by society and tormented by his conscience. In the end, Bob died alone, a broken and forgotten man. His obituary was brief and perfunctory, mentioning nothing of the scandal that had defined his life. His name was rarely spoken in Harmony Creek, and his memory was relegated to the darkest corners of the town's history. Bob's actions had destroyed his family and his standing in the community and left him a legacy of shame. His gravestone, far from Harmony Creek, remained unmarked. The story of Sheriff Darla Mays is a tragedy, a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of betrayal, abuse, and unchecked rage. Was justice served? Perhaps in a legal sense. Darla was held accountable for her actions, and Bob faced the consequences of his. But true justice, the kind that heals and restores, seemed elusive in this case. The lasting implications of this tragedy are profound. It shattered a family, divided a community, and left deep scars that may never fully heal. It exposed the dark underbelly of a seemingly perfect town and revealed the hidden secrets and dysfunctions that can fester beneath the surface. The moral of the story, if there is one, is that violence is never the answer. While Darla's anger was understandable, her actions only compounded the tragedy and created more pain and suffering. Perhaps the most important lesson is the need to protect children from abuse and to provide support and resources for victims of trauma. Sarah's story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, but it is also a reminder of the lasting damage that abuse can inflict. Ultimately, the case of Sheriff Darla Mays serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the fragility of the human condition and the devastating consequences that can result when trust is broken and rage takes control. It highlights the importance of seeking help, of finding healthy ways to cope with trauma, and of remembering that even in the darkest of times, hope is always possible. The story of Harmony Creek is a reminder of the darkness that can lurk within us all and the importance of striving for light.